The Louisiana sun did not rise so much as it bled across the horizon, spilling its color into the mist that hung low over the sugar fields. In 1847, the Delacroix plantation stood like an island of arrogance, carved out of the swamps and held together by cruelty and ritual. It was a kingdom of routine, the creak of wagon wheels, the ring of metal striking wood, and the hollow echo of a whip cutting through the dawn. There were sounds on that land that no one questioned anymore. Suffering had a rhythm, and it played daily under the hum of insects and the soft clatter of chains. The house itself was enormous, painted white but stained with the years. It rose above the fields like a monument to pride, its columns tall and unbending, each one a silent witness to the years of labor that built it. At its center lived Elias Delacroix, a man whose name was known for miles. His wealth came from sugar, his reputation from power, and his control from fear. He had inherited the land from his father and expanded it beyond imagination, boasting nearly 200 enslaved people. To him, every life on that soil, human or animal, was a gear in his grand machine. Inside the mansion, the air was thick with the scent of tobacco and oil lamps. Portraits lined the walls, stern faces of men who had built their fortunes on other men's backs. Elias admired those portraits, not for what they were, but for what they represented, the illusion of order. He believed himself a custodian of tradition, a man tasked by God to maintain the hierarchy between master and slave, white and black, heaven and earth. That belief had hardened him, made him into a figure that his neighbors both respected and feared. But behind the order he projected, there was decay. His estate was prosperous, but his household was hollow. His wife had died years before, leaving behind only one child, Thomas Delacroix. The boy had grown under the shadow of his father's expectations, fed on scripture, discipline, and the unspoken rule that emotions were a form of weakness. By the time he reached his 20s, he carried himself with the politeness of the educated, but the emptiness of the trapped. Elias had sent him away for schooling in New Orleans, hoping to shape him into a mirror of himself. Yet the city had filled Thomas with something his father could never control: curiosity. He returned home different, quieter, thoughtful, and somehow distant. The plantation felt smaller to him now, the rhythms harsher. He began to notice things he had ignored as a boy: the exhaustion in the faces of the field workers, the way laughter vanished when Elias entered a room, the emptiness of prayers that were meant to justify pain. There was a heaviness in his chest that no sermon could dissolve. The enslaved people of Delacroix plantation knew how to read moods, how to measure danger by the look in a white man's eyes. They could see that Thomas was not like his father. He greeted them by name, spoke softly, and never raised his voice. Some saw kindness, others saw recklessness. In a place like this, even compassion could be a form of danger. The barn became his refuge. It was quiet there, away from his father's watch, away from the heavy eyes of the overseer. He would walk there at dusk, under the pretext of tending to the horses. But it wasn't the animals that drew him, it was the people. 3 women worked there, tending the stalls and carrying feed: Amara, Celeste, and Ruth. Each had been brought to the plantation at different times, each marked by the scars of a life owned by another. Amara, with her quiet gaze and steady hands, had been born on the Delacroix land. Celeste had come from Virginia, sold after her master's death. Ruth, the youngest, barely 20, carried a look of fear that never left her eyes. Thomas found himself lingering near them, asking small questions about their work, their families, their days. It began with simple gestures, a shared piece of bread, a word of comfort when a lash found its mark. Yet every moment carried risk. A white man's kindness toward an enslaved woman was never seen as kindness by others. It was seen as corruption, weakness, or sin. But Thomas could not stop. There was something in their silence that made him ache. It was as if, through them, he could see a mirror of his own captivity, different in form, the same in spirit. He began to visit the barn at night, when the fields fell silent and the only light came from a lantern's trembling flame. There he would talk with them, about books, about music, about freedom. They listened, unsure whether to trust his words, but drawn to the humanity in his tone. Slowly, boundaries dissolved. What began as conversation turned to closeness, and closeness to something forbidden. The nights grew heavier, the air thicker. The old wood of the barn became witness to whispered laughter, soft confessions, and the kind of warmth that had no place in a world built on chains. For Thomas, it was not rebellion. It was discovery. He had found something that felt real, something that defied the coldness of his father's house. For Amara, Celeste, and Ruth, it was more complicated. Affection mixed with fear, hope with resignation. They knew how quickly tenderness could turn to ruin. But still, they stayed. Because in that stolen space, they were not property. They were seen. Outside, the plantation slept, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see the cracks forming in its walls. But the South was a place where rumors traveled like wildfire. The overseer, a cruel man named Carter, began to suspect something. He noticed the late nights, the footprints in the dirt, the whisper of voices when none should be there. And he watched. Because on plantations like Delacroix, secrets were currency. All it would take was one moment, one careless sound, one wrong word, for everything to shatter. And so the days went on, the heat rising, the tension growing like a storm, cloud no one dared acknowledge, the master's pride, the son's secret, the women's fear, all converging quietly beneath the same roof, waiting for the moment when truth would no longer stay silent. In the distance, the fields glowed under the setting sun, rows of sugar cane stretching endlessly toward the horizon. To the outside world, the plantation was thriving, its wealth measured in crops and slaves. But those who lived within its boundaries knew better. They could feel the unease, like the tremor that comes before an earthquake. Something was shifting beneath the surface of Delacroix land. Something that would soon tear apart everything the master had built. The days on Delacroix plantation followed a rhythm that seemed eternal. Dawn meant labor, dusk meant silence, and night belonged to the kind of darkness that swallowed dreams whole. But somewhere within that routine, beneath the hum of cicadas and the weight of the humid Louisiana air, the walls between master and slave began to blur in secret. Thomas Delacroix had found refuge in that forbidden space where hierarchy faltered and humanity dared to breathe. His father, Elias, believed that control was the essence of order. He ruled with scripture in one hand and the lash in the other, convinced that obedience was the natural language of the world. Yet his son had begun to speak another, one born of empathy and quiet rebellion. In the evenings, when the sun bled into the horizon and the fields were reduced to shadows, Thomas would walk the path to the barn carrying a small lantern that flickered with uncertainty. Each night he told himself he would stay only a moment to check the horses, to count supplies, but each night he stayed longer. Inside the barn, the air was thick with hay, dust, and something unspoken. Amara was usually the first he saw. Her presence filled the room with stillness. She was in her late 20s, strong, calm, and silent in a way that made others listen without words. Celeste would hum softly while she worked, a tune without origin, something her mother had sung before she was sold away. Ruth, barely more than a girl, worked fast, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds as if she expected someone to burst in. Thomas would bring them small things, sometimes fruit from the house kitchen, sometimes a piece of cloth from town. They were tokens, gestures of something he didn't yet understand. At first, the women said little. They knew better than to trust the kindness of men like him. But Thomas never commanded, never boasted, and never treated them as property. He asked questions no one had ever asked before, what their names truly were, what places they came from before Delacroix land, what they dreamed about when the nights grew long. Slowly, their fear began to thin. One night, while a thunderstorm rolled over the hills, Amara spoke of her mother for the first time. She had been born in the same fields she now worked, never knowing another world beyond the cane rows and the cabin walls. Thomas listened, his face pale in the lantern light, realizing for the first time how small his own world had been. Celeste, told him of Virginia, of being sold after her master's death and taken south by traders who chained people like cattle. Ruth said nothing for a long time, only whispering later that she didn't remember her mother's face. Their stories carved something into him, something sharp and permanent. He began to see the plantation not as a home, but as a prison disguised as prosperity. The wealth his father boasted about now looked like theft dressed in respectability. And the three women who stood before him, their faces half lit by flickering light, seemed more human than anyone he'd met in the halls of his family mansion. The connection deepened in ways no one planned. Thomas would read to them from books he'd brought back from New Orleans, tales of faraway lands, of heroes and rebels and gods who punished tyrants. They didn't always understand the words, but they understood the feeling behind them. In those moments, the barn became a sanctuary, a place where for an hour or two the rules of the world dissolved, but the danger of their closeness was constant, as real as the whip that hung in the overseer's quarters. Carter, the overseer, began to take notice. He had an instinct for weakness and could smell disobedience like blood in the water. He watched Thomas's movements, counted his steps, and noted every flicker of a lantern that burned after midnight. For the enslaved, the rumors began quietly. A few whispered that the master's son had fallen under a spell, that he spent nights with the women in the barn. Others warned them to stay silent. Rumors like that could destroy lives. But whispers are wind. They find their way into cracks, through walls, into ears that should never hear them. Thomas knew the risk. He told himself that what he was doing was not wrong, that the feelings he felt, the care he showed, were human, not sinful. Yet deep down, he knew the world would not see it that way. In a place where power defined truth, love itself could be a form of rebellion. He began to sneak to the barn more often. Sometimes he brought wine, other times just himself. The nights blurred together in memory and emotion, his voice low, their laughter soft, their fear hidden beneath fragile peace. What existed between them was neither romance nor possession. It was something rawer, born from loneliness and defiance. Amara, despite her quiet strength, warned him once. "You play with a fire that burns men like you too," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground. But he didn't listen. He couldn't. He believed naively that his father would never know, that the world inside the barn existed beyond consequence. But in plantations like Delacroix's, secrets had a way of revealing themselves. Every gesture, every glance, every shift in routine could unravel a hidden truth. Carter, determined to please Elias Delacroix, began to gather evidence. He followed Thomas one night through the fields and toward the barn. From a distance, he saw the faint glow of a lantern and heard faint laughter, an intimacy that shattered the illusion of control. He said nothing at first. He waited. He watched. Because knowledge, to men like Carter, was worth more than loyalty. He imagined the reward, the favor he'd earn from the master once the truth was laid bare, and so he let the secret ripen, fattened by the silence of those who dared not speak. Meanwhile, inside the barn, the four of them lived like ghosts suspended between two worlds. Theirs was a fragile balance, one built on longing and denial, tenderness and terror. Each night, when the lantern was extinguished and the darkness wrapped around them, they knew it couldn't last. But none of them had the strength to stop. The South was full of such stories, unwritten, unspoken, buried in memory and shame. But this one, on the Delacroix plantation, had a particular cruelty, because it wasn't just about desire or defiance. It was about the inevitable clash between a father's empire and a son's humanity. And as Carter's watchful eyes followed Thomas closer each night, the boundary between secrecy and exposure grew razor thin. Every morning Elias would sit at his long table, drinking his coffee, unaware, or perhaps refusing to see, the signs that his household was slipping from his control. The servants moved differently. The overseer lingered at his door. The plantation's hum no longer carried obedience but unease. Something was coming, heavy and unstoppable, like a storm creeping over the fields, and when it finally came, it would not only expose the affair hidden in the barn, it would unravel everything the Delacroix name stood for. It was the sound of a horse that did it, a restless neigh cutting through the thick August air long before dawn. Elias Delacroix was a light sleeper, always had been. Men who owned everything tended to wake easily, for they feared the smallest sound might signal the loss of something that belonged to them. He rose from bed, the air hot and unmoving, the mansion silent except for the faint creak of the shutters. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled far away. He reached for his lantern, its weak glow throwing long, trembling shadows along the wooden floor. The plantation slept. Only the cicadas and the river's slow murmur broke the silence. He moved through the hall, down the staircase lined with portraits of stern men who stared back at him as if to remind him what legacy demanded. He thought he heard whispering once, maybe whined against the walls, maybe something else. Then came another sound, the dull thud of movement in the barn. He frowned. The horses should have been still at that hour. The overseer was asleep, and no slave would dare enter the barn without permission, not unless there was something worth risking their skin for. Lantern in hand, Elias stepped outside. The humidity clung to him like wet cloth. The earth smelled of rain and molasses, and the barn loomed in the distance, a black shape against a bruised sky. He walked faster than he meant to, suspicion tightening in his chest. In 30 years he had learned that secrets lived in the dark corners of his land, and nothing good ever came from shadows moving where they shouldn't. When he reached the barn, he heard it, quiet laughter, soft and breathless, the kind that belongs to intimacy. He froze, his breath catching, his jaw tightening. For a moment he tried to believe it was nothing, but the sound came again, muffled voices, then the faint rhythm of movement. He knew that sound. He had heard it in other barns, in other times, when his overseers took what they wanted from the women who had no choice. But this was different. This was not the sound of violence. This was affection. His hand shook as he unlatched the door. The wood groaned, the hinges moaned, and his lantern light sliced through the darkness. In that single, trembling moment, the world he had built turned to glass and shattered. There they were. His son, Thomas, shirtless, half kneeling on the hay. The lantern glow caught his face, young, unguarded, terrified. Around him, 3 women froze. Amara, Celeste, and Ruth, their eyes wide, their breaths sharp. For a long second, no one spoke. The only sound was the hiss of the lantern flame. Elias stood there, his face pale with fury and disbelief. The heat that rushed through him was not just anger, it was humiliation. His heir, his blood, his future, the Delacroix name, defiled, tainted, ruined by the very people he owned. It wasn't that he hadn't known such things happened. Other men's sons indulged and were forgiven. But to see it, to see his own son entangled in it, was something else entirely. It wasn't just sin. It was rebellion. Thomas tried to speak, but Elias's voice came first, sharp and cold as a blade. Get up. No one moved. The women stood still, their faces turned away, trembling. Thomas rose slowly, his eyes pleading. Father, please. Not another word, Elias hissed. Do you know what you've done? Do you have any idea what this means? Thomas tried again, his voice shaking. It isn't what you think. Elias laughed once, low and cruel. Not what I think. My son, my heir, rolling in the dirt with slaves in my barn. Tell me, boy, what am I supposed to think? The words cut through the air like whips. The 3 women remained silent, knowing that no defense could save them. To speak would be to invite death. To move would be to provoke him further. The lantern light flickered, catching the glint of sweat on their faces. Elias's rage grew, darker with every heartbeat. He saw his wife's portrait in his mind, her proud, pale face, and felt her ghost watching him, judging him for what his household had become. His empire of order, now stained with the chaos of forbidden touch. Do you know what they'll say? He snarled. Do you know what they'll whisper in town when they hear this? That the Delacroix line is corrupted, that my son has mixed with the very blood we own. Thomas stepped forward, desperate. "They're not what you think they are. They're slaves!" Elias roared, striking the side of the barn with his cane so hard the wood splintered. "Property! You don't feel for them. You don't speak to them. And you damn sure don't touch them." The silence that followed was unbearable. The storm outside broke then, rain beginning to fall in heavy, uneven drops, the sound of it mixing with the ragged breathing in the barn. Elias's eyes darted from his son to the women, his fury turning into something more dangerous. Resolve. "Carter!" he shouted into the darkness. The overseer was never far. His instincts had told him to stay close that night. He appeared. Moments later, half-dressed, holding a pistol, confusion turning to satisfaction as he saw what unfolded. Elias didn't have to explain. The overseer's smirk said it all. "Chain them," Elias ordered. Carter hesitated only for a second. He looked at Thomas, unsure, but Elias's glare silenced any question. The clink of iron followed. Ruth cried out once, a sound quickly swallowed by the rain. Celeste bit her lip until it bled. Amara stood motionless, her face unreadable. Thomas lunged forward. "Don't touch them!" Carter struck him across the face with the back of his hand, and Thomas fell to his knees. Elias didn't stop it. He watched his son crumble, the heir who had betrayed him, and felt a strange mix of fury and victory. "You've brought shame on my name," he said quietly, "and you will cleanse it before everyone who's seen this." Thomas's voice broke. "Father, please don't do this." Elias turned away, unwilling to look at him. "You've already done it, boy. I'm only restoring what you destroyed." He left the barn then, rain soaking his shoulders, his lantern extinguished by the wind. Behind him the cries began, low, restrained, choked. Carter dragged the women out, one by one, toward the slave quarters. Thomas lay in the mud, his face buried in his hands, his body trembling. By morning, the entire plantation knew. The news traveled from cabin to cabin, whispered under breaths, carried by the air itself. The master had caught his son with the slaves, and something terrible was coming. Elias did not sleep that night, pacing the floor of his study until dawn. Every shadow in the room seemed to mock him. Every creak of the house reminded him that his authority had been violated not by outsiders, but from within his own bloodline. To him, it wasn't just about betrayal, it was about control. And if control was broken, everything else, wealth, power, legacy, would follow. So when the sun rose, painting the fields gold, Elias knew what he would do. The humiliation had to be purged. His son had to be broken before the eyes of all who worked his land. The Delacroix name would not be whispered in shame, it would be feared again, and with that decision, the yard outside became a stage for something no one on that plantation would ever forget. By the time the sun broke over the fields, the air had already thickened with dread. The storm had passed, but its silence felt heavier than thunder. Word had spread through the quarters like wildfire. Everyone knew. The master had caught his son in the barn with 3 enslaved women. It was the kind of story no one dared to speak aloud, yet no one could stop thinking about. The plantation, usually humming with the sounds of work, now moved like a body holding its breath. Every motion was slower, every voice quieter. Even the birds seemed to stay away from the yard that morning, as though they understood what was about to happen. Elias Delacroix stood on the balcony of his house, his face pale in the early light. He hadn't slept. His eyes were hollow, his jaw set with a determination that frightened even him. He had built his life on control, on being the one who commanded order out of chaos. And now that order had been violated, not by his enemies, but by his own son. To him, this wasn't just a scandal. It was a personal apocalypse. He called for Carter before breakfast, his voice sharp enough to cut through the morning fog. The overseer came quickly, smelling faintly of liquor, his expression eager. He knew something monumental was coming. Elias gave his orders in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. Everyone was to be brought to the yard. Every man, woman, and child on the property. No one was to be absent. His son and the 3 women were to stand before them, and no one, not even the cook, was to speak a word unless spoken to. By mid-morning, the yard was full. Rows of enslaved. People stood in silence, their faces drawn and expressionless. Years of surviving had taught them how to stand still in the face of horror, how to show no reaction even when their hearts screamed. The overseers stood near the steps, armed and ready, though no one dared to move. The heat was unbearable. The smell of sweat and soil hung heavy, the kind of scent that clings to memory long after it's gone. Then came Thomas. 2 guards led him out from the main house, his wrists bound, his shirt torn from the night before. His face was swollen, one eye darkened from Carter's blow. Yet his head was held high, even as fear flickered beneath the surface. Behind him walked Amara, Celeste, and Ruth. Their chains clinked with every step. Their dresses were stained. With dirt and hay, their eyes empty. They didn't look at Thomas. They didn't look at anyone. To look was to risk breaking whatever thin line held them upright. Elias stepped down from the balcony, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. His cane struck the earth with each step, a deliberate rhythm that echoed through the silence. When he reached the center of the yard, he turned to face them all. His voice, when it came, was calm. Too calm. "My house," he began, "has been stained with shame." No one moved. The words hung heavy in the air, rolling slowly across the crowd. Thomas closed his eyes. "This," Elias continued, "is what happens when the blood of masters mixes with the blood of slaves, when pride is forgotten, when the order of God himself is defied." He turned to his son. "You have betrayed everything your name stands for. You have disgraced your mother, your ancestors, and me. And for what? For lust? For sin?" Thomas shook his head weakly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It wasn't sin, Father." The statement struck Elias harder than a shout. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "Do not use that word in my presence. You will not speak of love here." He gestured toward the women. "You will renounce them, before everyone. You will say what they are. You will say that they are property, nothing more. And you will do it loudly enough for all to hear." The yard was silent, but for the wind moving through the cane. Thomas said nothing. His throat tightened, his breath shallow. The 3 women stood motionless, waiting, the weight of centuries pressing down on them. Elias stepped closer. "Do it." Thomas looked at Amara. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, calm and defiant, met his. Celeste stared at the ground, tears running silently down her cheeks. Ruth trembled, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Say it," Elias demanded. Thomas's voice cracked. "They're not property." For a moment, everything stopped. The words echoed through the air, soft but clear, a rebellion too small to change, the world but too powerful to be forgiven. Elias's face twisted. Without a word, he reached for the whip Carter handed him. It was long, braided leather, the kind that left scars like handwriting. Thomas flinched, realizing too late that his defiance had sealed more than his own fate. The first crack split the air like thunder. Thomas's knees buckled. Another, sharper, tearing through his shirt and skin. The crowd did not move. They had seen such things before, but never like this. To watch the master punish his own blood, it was a spectacle of horror none would end. "Forget," Elias's voice broke with fury. "You will speak the truth, or I will beat it into you." Thomas gasped through pain, the words barely leaving his lips. "They're not things." Another strike, then another. The sound of it mixed with the cicadas, the rustling cane, the heavy breathing of dozens of silent witnesses. Each lash was a sermon, each drop of blood a warning. The women could not move. Amara's face stayed rigid, her fists clenched until her nails broke skin. Celeste sobbed quietly, the sound muffled by her hand. Ruth's eyes were wide, empty, as though her soul had retreated far from that place. After the 6th strike, Thomas collapsed. Elias stood above him, his chest heaving, his rage no longer dignified but animal. He threw the whip aside and looked, up at the faces watching him. "This," he said, his voice raw, "is what happens when you forget who you are, when you forget your place." He turned to Carter. "Take them, sell them, all 3, far away. I never want to hear their names. Again, the overseer nodded, his grin returning like a shadow. He moved forward, gripping Amara's arm roughly, but she didn't resist. None of them did. The weight of survival was heavier than chains. Elias looked down at his son, broken in the mud. For a moment, there was something almost human in his eyes. Regret, fear, the flicker of a man realizing the cost of his own power. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He turned away and walked back toward the house, leaving the yard in silence. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their steps quiet, their eyes averted. But though no one spoke, everyone knew they had witnessed something sacred in its horror. A master punishing not his slave, but his own reflection. The field hands would whisper for years about that morning. They would say the whip did not strike Thomas alone, that every lash struck the house itself, the name itself, the myth of purity Elias had spent a lifetime protecting. They would say that from that day on, the plantation was never the same. The land grew quieter, the house darker, the air heavier, and though Elias believed he had restored order, what he had truly done was release something that could never again be bound. The wagons left before dawn. The road was soft with mud, the wheels creaking under the weight of what they carried. The women were bound in silence, their wrists bruised from the iron cuffs, their faces hidden by the rough cloths that the overseer had tied around their heads. It was meant to keep them quiet, but it only deepened the feeling that they were already ghosts, alive, but unseen. The overseer Carter rode ahead on horseback, a flask hanging from his belt and a pistol resting easy on his hip. Behind him, 2 armed guards followed, their laughter cold and meaningless against the still air. Amara could not see where they were going, but she could feel it, the distance growing between her and the only place she had ever known. The plantation had been her prison, but it was also her history. Every scar on her skin had a memory of that soil. Every breath she had taken there carried the voices of those who had come before her. Now she was being dragged into the unknown, stripped not just of freedom but of everything familiar. Celeste's hands trembled as she tried to shift her weight, the iron cutting deeper into her skin. Her body still ached from the night in the barn, from the fear, from the shame she had been forced to feel for something she had never chosen. Ruth, the youngest, whispered to herself softly, almost in rhythm with the turning wheels. A prayer, maybe, or a promise. The sound of it barely rose above the crunch of gravel. Behind them, the plantation receded into the fog. Thomas watched from the upper window, his body still broken, his heart heavier than the chains that had taken them away. He had begged his father to stop the sale, to show mercy. But Elias's silence was final. He had given his son no words, only orders. Orders to heal, to forget, to act as though nothing had ever happened. But Thomas couldn't. The image of Amara's eyes, calm even in pain, haunted him more than the whip ever had. The journey was long, cutting through swamps and forests, past towns where people looked away from the wagons as they passed. The slave trade was an open secret. Everyone knew, and no one cared. The sight of chained women drew no shock, only silence, as if the world had collectively agreed that this cruelty was normal. The women were sold to a broker 2 days later, their names replaced by numbers, their histories erased by ink and profit. Carter took his payment without hesitation. He didn't think about the women again. To him, they were transactions, not memories. He returned to the plantation with a ledger in his pocket and a bottle of whiskey to wash away the last traces of guilt. But some stains don't wash off. When he arrived, Elias was waiting on the porch. His face looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper. He asked no questions about where they had been sent. He didn't want to know. It was easier to believe that what was gone no longer existed. He only asked if the matter was finished. Carter nodded. "It's done." Elias gave a curt nod and turned away. But something in him cracked that moment. His world, once defined by power and order, had shifted. The house that had stood as a symbol of control now felt hollow. His wife barely spoke to him. The servants moved with a quiet fear, and even the walls seemed to listen differently. as though they too remembered the screams. At night, he heard them. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of the whip, the sound of his son's voice, begging, the echo of the women's chains. He would wake drenched in sweat, the candlelight flickering against the ceiling, unsure whether the sound came from memory or from something darker. Thomas grew weaker. His wounds healed on the surface, but his spirit did not. He stopped speaking to his father altogether. He worked with the field hands when he could, his hands blistered and raw, his once privileged skin now darkened by the sun. The slaves looked at him differently, not as an equal, but not entirely as a master either. He existed somewhere in between, a man without a place. Sometimes he would walk to the edge of the fields where the land opened into the forest. There he would stand for hours, staring into the trees as though expecting someone to emerge. He imagined that Amara was out there somewhere, still alive, still strong, still defying him to forget. But Amara was not dead. She had been sold to a smaller plantation 2 counties away, a place harsher and poorer than Delacroix's estate. The master there was a widower who took what he wanted without words. Yet Amara never broke. Her silence became her armor. When he beat her, she stared. Through him. When he cursed her, she prayed under her breath. Celeste did not survive long. The fever took her during the summer rains, her body too weak to fight it. The overseer buried her without ceremony. Ruth lived on, but her mind drifted far from the present. She would speak of the barn sometimes, of Thomas, of a promise that one day the truth would be known. But no one listened. The world was built to forget. Back at the Delacroix plantation, time began to rot. The crops faltered. The workers whispered that the land was cursed, that the blood spilled had poisoned the soil. Elias dismissed it as nonsense, but even he could not ignore the dying harvest. Each season brought less, and each year the debts grew heavier. He tried to restore control the only way he knew, through punishment, through fear, but it no longer worked. His authority had been weakened, his son's disobedience a stain that would not wash away. He caught Thomas one afternoon kneeling in the empty barn, whispering the women's names. The sight filled him with something between rage and terror. "You still dare speak of them?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. Thomas turned, his face pale but resolute. "You can sell them, Father. You can pretend they never lived. But their names don't belong to you." Elias struck him across the face, but Thomas didn't flinch. That defiance, quiet and steady, unnerved him more than any rebellion. He left the barn without another word, his hand shaking as he gripped his cane. That night, thunder rolled in from the horizon. Rain pounded against the windows. In the darkness, Elias thought he heard voices, 3 women, whispering softly, chanting his name like a curse. He lit a candle and walked the halls, but the sound followed him. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't imagination. It was the memory of what he'd done, alive and breathing in the very walls of his house. By morning, he found himself staring at the fields again, the soil dark and still. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. The plantation, his kingdom, his legacy, it was all slipping away. His son no longer obeyed. His wife no longer loved him. The land no longer yielded. The past, which he had tried so hard to bury, was now all that remained. He told himself it was madness, but deep down, he knew. Some things cannot be whipped away, sold away, or silenced. Some sins are too heavy for even God to forgive. And though the wagons had long since disappeared down the road, the sound of their wheels never stopped echoing in his mind. The days bled together in a haze of heat and decay. The Delacroix plantation, once a place of power and routine, now felt like a house waiting for its own death. The crops had failed again that season, and the overseers had begun to mutter that the soil itself was cursed. The slaves worked slower, quieter. They no longer sang in the fields. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the land itself carried the memory of what had happened. The humiliation, the punishment, the betrayal that had broken something sacred. Elias Delacroix moved through his home like a ghost. He no longer held Gatherings no longer rode through the fields to inspect the work. He sat in the study most days, staring at his books without reading them. The air inside the house had turned stale, filled with dust and the faint scent of whiskey. Every creak of the wooden floor seemed to echo louder than it should. Thomas had left months ago. No one saw him go, but everyone knew he would not return. Some said he'd gone north, joining the abolitionists he'd secretly admired from afar. Others said he'd drowned himself in the river after hearing that Amara had died in childbirth. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the emptiness he left behind. Elias refused to speak his son's name. He had erased him from the ledgers, from conversation, from memory. But erasure is a fragile kind of power. It doesn't destroy the past, it only buries it. And like rot beneath the soil, it always finds a way back to the surface. The nights grew restless. Elias began to dream of the barn again. He would wake drenched in sweat, the sound of whispering filling the room, faint but distinct. 3 voices, soft and deliberate, as though reciting a prayer. Sometimes he thought he saw figures in the hallway, shadows that disappeared when he turned his head. Once he found muddy footprints leading from the front door to the staircase. Though no one in the house admitted to making them, the slaves kept their distance. They whispered that the master had gone mad. Some claimed they saw him talking to himself by the fire, his lips moving in the dark. Others said he'd been seen walking barefoot through the fields at midnight, muttering names that had long since been sold away. One morning, the cook, a quiet woman named Hester, found him standing in the parlor with an old photograph, a small daguerreotype of Thomas as a child. Elias was tracing the boy's face with a trembling finger. When she asked if he wanted breakfast, he didn't answer. He only whispered, he was supposed to fix everything. The illusion of control that Elias had built his entire life around had begun to unravel. His reputation in the county faltered. The neighboring planters whispered behind his back, mocking his family's disgrace. The overseers grew careless. Without Thomas to inherit the estate, there was no future to protect, no legacy to preserve. What was once a symbol of Southern pride was now a ruin in waiting. The slaves felt the change too. Though Elias still commanded them, his authority was hollow. They obeyed because habit demanded it, not fear. And at night, when the fires dimmed, they spoke of the old master's madness with quiet satisfaction. Some said it was justice, others said it was God. The barn where it all happened had been abandoned. The doors hung crooked, the wood warped from rain. No one dared go inside, not even the overseers. Rumor spread that anyone who entered after dark would hear chains dragging across the floor, or see the figure of a woman standing in the corner, her eyes shining in the dark. Elias forbade anyone to speak of it, but even he couldn't stay away. One stormy night, he went to the barn alone. The rain lashed against the windows, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. His lantern flickered as he stepped inside. The place felt smaller than he remembered, the silence almost suffocating. He stood in the same spot where he had once made his son kneel. He remembered the look in Thomas's eyes, not fear, but something else. Disgust, maybe. Pity. He fell to his knees, clutching the dirt. His voice cracked as he spoke into the darkness. I did what I had to. It was order. It was law. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it a whisper. That sounded like laughter. He froze, his pulse hammering in his chest. The whisper came again, 3 voices now, overlapping, soft but unmistakable. He turned the lantern toward the sound, but the light caught only emptiness. Yet the air around him grew cold, and the whispering continued until he could no longer tell whether it came from the barn or from inside his own mind. He stumbled out into the rain, the lantern falling and shattering behind him. The next morning the workers found him collapsed by the steps of the house, his clothes soaked through, his lips moving without sound. He survived, but something in him had broken completely. He no longer left his room. He refused food. The doctor said it was fever. The slaves said it was judgment. Weeks passed, and the house grew quieter still. The walls seemed to creak more often. The wind always seemed to find its way inside. Hester continued to bring food to the master's room, but most days he didn't touch it. Sometimes she heard him talking to someone, a low murmur of apology and pleading. Once, when she opened the door without knocking, she found him sitting upright in bed, staring at the empty chair across from him. "You see them too, don't you?" he asked. She left the tray and fled without answering. By autumn, the Delacroix name had become a cautionary tale among the neighboring estates. They spoke of madness, of curses, of sins that refused to die. The fields grew wild, overtaken by weeds. The fences broke, and no one bothered to mend them. The plantation had become a hollow monument to pride and guilt, a reminder of how easily power can consume itself. The final blow came when a traveling preacher stopped by one evening, offering prayer and repentance. He found Elias lying in his study, barely conscious, his skin pale and cold. The preacher leaned close to hear his final words. What he heard chilled him to the bone. Elias whispered, "They're still here. They never left." The preacher left before dawn, refusing to stay another night. He told the neighbors later that the house was unholy, that something inside it refused peace. Within days, word spread that the Delacroix master had died. Some said it was the fever. Others said he had simply stopped breathing, as if the weight of what he'd done had finally crushed the air from his lungs. The enslaved workers buried him under the oak tree by the fields, without ceremony, without prayer. As they shoveled the dirt, one of them whispered, "Now he belongs to the land he poisoned." And when the wind passed through the branches that night, it sounded almost like three voices, soft, unbroken, and free. Time eventually erased the name Delacroix from most records. The plantation's ledger scattered, its house left to rot and sink into the marshland. When the Civil War came, soldiers passed through and found only an empty shell, shattered windows, vines crawling up the porch columns, and a barn whose doors swayed endlessly in the wind. The air inside smelled of rust and decay. No one knew what had happened there, but they felt it, the unease that lingers when a place remembers more than it should. The locals began to call it the house that moans. Travelers who camped near it at night swore they heard voices, the faint rhythm of chains, the sound of someone weeping softly in the dark. Years later, when the state began to map and catalog abandoned estates, a historian named Samuel Green came across the Delacroix property. The records he found were sparse, but there was a single note from a parish clerk in 1851, written in a tight, cautious hand. Family name ruined. Son fled. Master dead of fever. Slaves dispersed or sold. House empty, but not quiet. That line, "not quiet," caught Green's attention. He decided to visit. The path to the plantation was almost invisible now, swallowed by tall grass and cypress roots. The sun was low when he arrived, casting long shadows across the cracked foundation. Inside, the house was still, but not silent. The boards creaked underfoot as though reacting to every breath. In the study, Green found remnants of the master's life. Ledgers, a rusted quill, and a half-burned photograph of a young man. On the back, someone had written, "T." The image was faint, but the expression on the boy's face was unmistakably human. Soft, almost kind. Green wondered if that was the son the records spoke of. He moved through the rooms, careful not to disturb what time had left intact. In one corner, a rosary lay coiled on the floor, the beads blackened with age. In another, a cracked mirror leaned against the wall, its surface warped so that any reflection looked twisted and foreign. When Green turned toward the window, he thought he saw movement outside, 3 figures walking slowly toward the barn. He blinked, and they were gone. That night he made camp nearby, intending to sketch the ruins by morning light. But as the hours passed, the silence grew heavier. The air turned damp, cold, the kind of chill that feels alive. Around midnight, he heard footsteps, soft at first, then closer. He froze, his lantern flickering. The door to the barn creaked open on its own, though no wind stirred the trees. He stepped closer, drawn not by curiosity but by something older, instinctual, as though the ground itself wanted to show him its secrets. Inside, the barn smelled of mold and iron. The beams above were splintered, the walls blackened by age. Green raised the lantern, its light cutting through the dark in a trembling circle. There, etched into the wood, were names, 3 of them, carved deep: Amara, Celeste, Ruth. The letters had been cut with care, not by a master's hand, but by someone desperate to make memory endure. Beneath them, faint and almost lost, another name: Thomas. Green ran his fingers over the carvings, the grooves rough against his skin. The moment he touched the last name, the lantern flickered violently. The air seemed to hum, and for a brief instant he thought he heard breathing behind him. He turned, but the barn was empty. Still, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched, not with malice, but with patience, as though the walls themselves waited for him to understand. By dawn, Green had left, shaken but determined. He spent the following months gathering every record he could find: letters from neighbors, trade receipts, even oral accounts from the descendants of nearby plantations. What he uncovered was a story of control, shame, and ruin. A master who destroyed his son in the name of purity, a son who defied him through forbidden love, and 3 women whose names had nearly been lost, but survived through rumor and resistance. Deeper Green looked, the clearer a pattern became. The downfall of the Delacroix family was not an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror of the system that built it. Power built on ownership always collapses inward. Pride turns to guilt, control to madness. Elias Delacroix had been a man who believed he could command morality itself. In the end, he commanded only silence, and even that betrayed him. Green published his findings in a small historical journal, framing it as a study of moral decay within slaveholding society. But he could not bring himself to include what he had seen, or thought he had seen, in the barn. He simply ended the paper with a single line: "Some histories whisper louder than they were meant to." Over time, others visited the site. Some said the house was haunted, others dismissed it as superstition. But every few years, someone would report the same thing: a sense of being watched, of hearing voices that spoke in low rhythmic tones. Farmers who cut through the land at night claimed to see lanterns flickering by the barn long after it had collapsed into ruin. They said the light moved slowly, deliberately, as though following a path that no longer existed. By the turn of the century, the plantation had been reclaimed by the earth. The oaks grew thick, their roots splitting through the foundation. Only the barn's frame remained, leaning like a skeleton against the rising vines. When the river flooded in 1902, most of what was left disappeared beneath the water. But locals still told the story of the Delacroix curse, of the master's shame, his son's defiance, and the 3 women whose spirits refused to be forgotten. In time, the story became legend, stripped of names and turned into a warning. Parents told their children not to walk near the old road at dusk, or they'd hear the cries of the enslaved calling them home. Teenagers dared each other to stay near the barn ruins overnight, but none ever lasted until morning. The land, it seemed, had claimed its own justice, but for historians, the Delacroix story lived on for another reason. It was a case study in how power can corrode the very soul of a man, how systems built on domination demand a cost that even their architects cannot pay. Elias Delacroix had sought control over everything: his land, his slaves, his son, even the emotions that bound them. But control is an illusion. Once broken, it reveals the truth beneath, that fear and pride cannot hold together what humanity tears apart. In the end, the only thing that survived him were the names carved into the barn. Not his ledgers, not his wealth, not his rules. Just the faint traces of those who had suffered and endured, left behind in wood that refused to rot. It is said that when the light is right and the air is still, you can still see the carvings, glinting faintly through the moss as though freshly made. The Delacroix plantation was never rebuilt. The land was sold and resold, parceled out to strangers who knew nothing of its past. But the story lingered in the soil. Travelers passing through still speak of a strange quiet that settles over the place at sunset, a stillness that feels almost like breath. Some say it's sorrow, others call it peace. But those who know the story understand what it really is. Memory, the kind that refuses to die, no matter how much time or silence is laid over it. The kind that waits, whispering, until someone dares to listen again. History often hides its darkest truths in silence, and what we just uncovered is one of them. The story of the Delacroix plantation isn't just a tale of cruelty or madness. It's a reflection of what happens when power turns inward and devours itself. These stories are rarely told, yet they shaped the world we live in today. They remind us how easily control can become corruption, and how memory, no matter how deeply buried, always rises again. If you felt the weight of this story, if it made you think about how many histories like this have been forgotten, then I invite you to be part of keeping them alive. Subscribe to this channel for more dark, hidden chapters of history, real stories of pride, guilt, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. Every week we uncover another truth that the past tried to erase. Your thoughts matter here. Tell me, in the comments, what do you think justice looked like in a world that had none? Do you believe a place can hold on to the sins committed upon it? I read every comment, and your insight helps shape the next story we tell. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stay with us as we walk through the forgotten corners of history, where silence still speaks and the past never truly sleeps.